Hi, my name's Starsky and welcome to From the Studio on Clubbing TV. In this episode, I'm going to be taking a look at the rather complicated but rather marvellous Behringer 2600. And as you heard there, this can sound absolutely massive. But what is it exactly? Well, it's a 3-oscillator semi-modular synth, and it's a clone or a copy of one that was built by ARP back in the very, very early 70s. The original one was literally about this big, had built-in speakers, and it was used as a teaching tool, which is a bit odd because to teach somebody synthesis, this is probably the most complicated looking thing you could imagine. But this came along before things like the Mini Moog and more portable synths, and you can see why other more portable synths became a lot more popular. When you first look at it, it does look extremely complicated. Look at all these patch cables hanging out. What's a patch cable? If you've seen any of these shows before, you'll know what a semi-modular synth is. But essentially, instead of having switches, you use cables to tell one thing to do another thing, basically, or to get one signal to somewhere else. But on more modern synths, or synths that came after this, people routed it with switches because it was easier, it was neater, and then you could start using things like presets. But more recently, people have been getting back into older synths, the old analog stuff, and especially the modular and semi-modular. So Behringer have made this. It's around £650 for the blue or the grey version, and it's around $550 for the black and orange version. They're slightly different. This has got a real spring reverb inside, and the black and orange has got a digital emulation of a spring reverb. What's a spring reverb? It's literally a spring that sort of vibrates, and you can do this sort of thing with it. And if you saw my episode a couple of months ago on the ARP Odyssey, all this will look rather familiar because the ARP Odyssey was basically a cut down 2-voice version of this with a built-in keyboard and switches instead of patch cables. So let's start off by describing how that intro sound was done, because it's quite an interesting sound and it'll talk us through some of the features of it. It's a 3-oscillator synth, and on that you can hear 3 oscillators, and it sounds like it's playing 2 different things, which it is because it's duophonic, which means you can play 2 notes at the same time. So what we've got here, we've got oscillator 1, oscillator 2, and oscillator 3. And what we do is we split that up into 2 different lines, and we use this duo mode down here, so we can play. That's like a sort of bass chord, I suppose, and then an arpeggio over the top. So we've got 3 oscillators playing, we've got 2 playing the bass, and we've got 1 playing the top line. Or if you only play 1 note at a time, you just get 3 oscillators playing a big fat tone. We've got different waveforms from each of the oscillators. Oscillator 1's got a saw and a pulse, and oscillator 2 and 3 have got a triangle, a saw, a sine, and a pulse. All these things in the little boxes are the pre-patched routings. So the audio coming into the filter is pre-patched to have the pulse from VCO1, the pulse from VCO2, and the sawtooth from VCO3. So when you start off playing with this, you might want a sawtooth from VCO2 as well to make a big dual sawtooth sound. So you just plug the sawtooth from VCO2 into this mixer, anywhere on it, and then we've got the sawtooth. So when it looks really complicated when you see all the patch cables, actually it's just really simple stuff like that. So for example, for a square wave, we might want to put some pulse width modulation on that. So that's effectively the pulse width of the wave. This is this slider here. And a really common way of making that sound big and fat is to put an LFO on that so it sweeps and you get. And that's a really typical analog synth sound. So we just take the LFO output and we stick that into the pulse width modulation input on VCO2. And there you go. So all these little sliders at the bottom of the oscillators are basically modulation routines that do various things to the oscillator. So this one's the pulse width. And these three here are different ways of modulating the actual pitch of it. So we could modulate it with the sample and hold circuit down here. We can modulate it with the ADSR envelope. And we can even modulate it with the other oscillators. But you're not limited to that, as I say, because you can just patch something else into it if you like. So we could modulate it with the LFO. It's not pre-patched. We'll use the square out of the LFO. We've used the triangle over here on the PWM and bring that into the FM control. So really basic stuff. If you've ever programmed a synth and understand the concept and the basic concept, it's actually no issue using this at all. It's just laid out a little bit oddly. On the top here, we've got the oscillator tuning, and then we've got sync on the oscillators as well. It gives that sort of typical sort of ripping tone. So we're syncing oscillator 2 with oscillator 1. So these are all the standard things you might get on any synth really, but then we've got a low frequency mode on each of them as well. So each of these three oscillators becomes a low frequency oscillator. So let's modulate oscillator 2 with oscillator 1 again. And they're those typical sort of grainy FM sounds. And then we can change oscillator 1 into a low frequency oscillator. And obviously, because we can adjust the pulse width and we can bring in other things to modulate that, we can all of a sudden start to get really complex little things set up. Just showing you what the sort of effects you can get are, but you can use that to modulate anything. So you can use that to modulate the filter. So let's take a look at the filter then, shall we? So we've got a single low-pass filter with two different modes, and to be honest, I find it really difficult to tell the difference between the two modes. Let's just put a single sawtooth on VCO3. And go into the second mode. Sounds very similar, doesn't it? When you increase the resonance like you get with lots of low-pass filters, you lose the bass. But it is a really nice sounding filter. Let's take a look at this lower panel, shall we? First thing we come to on the bottom row is portamento. And that's what that does, it slides from note to note. Then we've got the LFO, and we've got LFO repeats and auto. But then we come to the much more interesting bit, and that's the preamp. And that's why I've got my little trusty TR-09 next to me, because I've plugged this in to the preamp, which means I can now take the signal from the TR-909 or the TR-09 and start doing things with it in the synth. So you can start taking any tone from anywhere and put it through the synth. And next to that, we've got this really interesting thing called an envelope follower, and that takes any sound and turns it into a voltage. So the louder the sound, the higher the voltage. And if you've got a voltage, you can plug it into anything in here and you can modulate stuff with it. So we'll take the output of that and we'll put it into, I don't know, let's put it into the filter. So now the filter will change depending on the drum loop. So let's put a sound on. Again, there's hours worth of just messing around and playing, and you start doing this, you start playing around with it, and all of a sudden something just pops out. Sounds great, and it's not something that you'd naturally come across perhaps. Next up then, we've got the ring modulator.
And this is how you sound like a Dalek.
And I think that's what everyone does when they first get their hands on a ring modulator, but it does an awful lot more. Here I'm going to use the standard routings of VCO1 Sawtooth and VCO2 Sine, which is a lot dirtier than, so you can get really, really gritty sounds from it. Next up on the bottom row, we've got this voltage processor, and I'm not going to go into that here. It's sort of like a modulation matrix, and you can do various things. It's really quite complex, so no time to do that here. And then we've got the sample and hold circuit we saw earlier, and of course there's the reverb. So I think that's been a good whistle-stop tour of the 2600, but now you've heard what it can do, is it for you? If you're new to synthesis, well, this may not be the one for you. I know it looks complicated and it can be complicated, but because of that, it's a little bit off-putting, I think, and you can get lost in it, whereas with a lot of simpler synths, it's harder to get lost. But if you are into your synths and you have done a bit of programming and you want something with a bit of edge and want something that's got a really nice, thick, vintage analog tone, I don't think you can go far wrong with these. For the money they cost, they're extraordinary good value. An original ARP 2600 will now cost you in excess £10,000, $10,000. Korg have also got a full-size version, but they only made a few of them, so even if you wanted one, you can't buy one. They've also got a mini version coming out, but that's £1,600, so it's £1,000 more than this. I'd love to get my hands on one to see exactly what the differences are, although I do know that one's much, much closer to the original. This has got a few extra bits, like it's got the sync and things like that. But it would be interesting to see them side by side to see why one is £1,000 more than the other. So I hope that was of some use to somebody somewhere, and if it was, don't forget that you can watch this whenever you like on our Clubbing TV official YouTube channel on the From the Studio playlist. And if you are into your synths and your drum machines and your music tech, take a look at my Starsky Carr YouTube channel as well. I've got a lot more in-depth look at both of these. So I'll see you in the next episode of From the Studio.